Welcome. My name is Shelley Latham. I am the community manager for linkengineering.org, an online educator exchange for PK through 12 engineering education. Are you all right, Anne? Link Engineering is a project of the National Academy of Engineering with sponsorship from Chevron. And today, I'm really excited to bring you a video conversation about defining STEM with Gregg Pearson and Anne Jolly. Hi, guys. Anne Jolly began her career as a lab scientist. She caught the science teaching bug and was recognized as an Alabama Teacher of the Year during her years as a middle grade science teacher. From 2007 to 2014, Anne was part of a National Science Foundation funded team that developed middle grades STEM curriculum modules and teacher professional development materials for the Mobile Area Education Foundation's Engaging Youth Through Engineering initiative. Anne has also teamed with science and math teachers to help them develop and implement their own STEM curriculum. Her book, STEM by Design, Strategies and Activities for Grades 4 through 8 was published by Routledge Middleweb in July of 2016. Welcome, Anne. Gregg Pearson is a scholar with the National Academy of Engineering in Washington, D.C. Gregg currently serves as the responsible staff officer for 2 National Science Foundation funded projects, one examining the status, role, and needs of engineering technology education in the United States, the other addressing issues related to capacity building for K-12 engineering educators. He also directs linkengineering.org. He's part of the team I work with. Previously, he has overseen projects addressing STEM integration in K-12 education, standards for K-12 engineering education, the status and prospects for engineering in K-12 education, new messaging for the field of engineering, and technology literacy and content standards for the field of technology education. Whew. So I can't really think of a better 2 people to talk to us today about what exactly STEM means. And it means different things to different people, and there is perhaps a little bit of confusion among various parties as to what exactly STEM education is or could be or should be. So Gregg is going to start us out with a little background in how STEM came to be STEM, and tell us a little bit about his perspective from the National Academy of Engineering.
Great, thanks, Shelley. And apologies first because of my voice. Those of you who know me know that I don't normally sound this way. I have a cold and I'm a little croaky, but I will do my best to enunciate clearly. And thanks for joining. I see a number of names that I recognize, and appreciate you taking time to listen to us today. As Shelley said, the Academy of Engineering and actually the National Academies writ large have had an interest in STEM education for a long time. But like most of the education world and policy world for that matter, we as an institution until recently haven't been all that clear ourselves about what STEM really is. And to sort of put a point on it that relates to the focus of Link Engineering, which is engineering in K-12, I was involved in a project that published a report back in 2009 that examined the current, at that time, state of efforts to teach engineering in K-12. The committee that produced that report made a number of recommendations and observations. And one of the observations that they made was that engineering seemed to be a very potentially valuable integrator of other subjects in STEM in particular, but not just STEM. And that there ought to be some effort to look at what the research had to say about integrating the subjects of science, technology, engineering, and math because that committee said it seems quite confusing if you listen to the general public discussion or education discussion in terms of what STEM, when that acronym is thrown around, actually is. And that observation actually resulted in another project several years later that Shelley mentioned that did explicitly examine the question of if STEM is more than just a casual grouping of these letters in an acronym, that is, if it actually suggests that there's a connection between, or can be, or maybe should be, connection between science, engineering, math, and technology, or at least some subset of those. How is that done? And what is the evidence that it makes a difference? What do we need to do to prepare teachers to teach in a more integrated fashion? And again, what does the research show about what the potential benefits are and what are the limitations? So we got money from the National Science Foundation to look at this question of what is STEM. And as a baseline, I think it's fair to say that most references, even today, to STEM education, really, if you listen carefully, are references to science education. So STEM has become a very casual term that is often used to refer to science. Sometimes it may refer to mathematics, but rarely those two things together. And the T and the E are often not mentioned at all. But as I said, we looked quite extensively at the literature from the learning sciences and from education research and published a report that looked in some detail at the nature of integration, the potential for integration in STEM, and some of the challenges that learners face and educators would face in terms of teaching us. So that report is available on the National Academy's Press website, but partly I think what we'd like to do now, rather than, of course, you can always go and look at the report after this conversation is through, but the committee prepared a short animated video that summarized some of its findings and also tried to define STEM in this more integrated fashion. And we thought we would it's a short video, it's a little corny, but we thought we might show it to you, and that could prompt some more discussion. But
what is STEM? It's the acronym for Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics, the disciplines that are vital for a thriving economy and a safe and healthy society. In kindergarten through 12th grade in the United States, most STEM teaching and learning focuses on science or mathematics. Comparatively little attention has been paid to the T, the products and systems that meet human needs, and E, the creative process used to design these things. And, for the most part, the four subjects have been taught in isolation. But new reform efforts, like the Next Generation Science Standards, are placing more emphasis on the connections between and among the STEM disciplines. To understand how this trend might affect teaching and learning in the future, we need to take a closer look at integrated STEM education, not just the individual subjects that make up the acronym. After all, in the real world, science relies on technology, mathematics, and engineering. And engineering depends on findings from science, the application of mathematics, and the use of technological tools. Imagine if K through 12 students were taught in ways that highlighted these connections. Would they learn more and more deeply? Might they see STEM disciplines as more relevant to their lives? Could it lead more of them to pursue STEM courses and careers? The answers to these questions depend in part on how integrated STEM education is implemented in schools and in out-of-school settings. Research suggests that implementation has to balance learning in the individual STEM subjects with more connected ways of learning. In addition, because it can be hard for students to make these connections themselves, teachers will need to make the connections explicit. Inside the classroom, some teachers may use instructional approaches like problem-based learning or engineering design which are special kinds of problem solving, to introduce integrated STEM education to their students. Outside the classroom, students are being exposed to STEM connections in museums and science centers through after-school experiences like some TV shows and STEM-focused robotics competitions, and in internships. However, we need more research to better understand the potential benefits and limitations of integrated STEM education for students, teachers, and schools. What, for example, are the implications of integrated STEM education for how schools are organized? How can teachers be better prepared to teach in integrated ways? And how can we test kids to determine what they are really learning and able to apply as a result of integrated STEM experiences? The list of questions is long, but getting answers is important for students, teachers, and the nation. For more information about integrated STEM education, check out the STEM Integration in K-12 Education Report.
What do you want to add to that, Gregg?
Well, obviously it's an oversimplification, but I think actually based on the popularity of that video, which I think it's got almost 250,000 views now, something like that, which is unusual for something in education to begin with and something out of the academies as well. I think it's kind of hit a chord with people. I think educators, teachers, classroom teachers, just like the rest of us, have been a little too loose or casual or unthinking about using that acronym. And I really think it's valuable, even if you're not able to execute completely integrated science or math education or engineering education, to at least appreciate, particularly with respect to engineering design, that math and science really do and can come into play in productive ways for student learning.
Okay, Anne, I want to bring you in. We do have a question that Kevin will address that question because I think it's a good question after we hear a little bit from Anne.
I'm on a small tablet in a hotel room, and so if I punch anything, it covers up the pictures and all. So now, okay, when we're talking about STEM. When we first started this, I had some of the most unusual experiences with schools who wanted to be declared STEM schools. And one of them, school number 1, for example, wanted to be recognized as a STEM middle school. So the principal added a computer program to its course of offering, along with algebra and biology. Now I ask you, is that a STEM school? I wish I could see your responses. Try this. Here's a school that identifies itself as a STEM school because it offers advanced placement courses in math and in science. Does that make it a STEM school? No. In fact, I really ran into one that kind of took the cake. It said, one middle school said that they were a STEM school because they taught math and science already, and they've been doing that for years. What is it that makes a school a STEM school? So let's take a look, if we can, at some of the things that you might ask yourself about your STEM program to see, do we have a STEM school? Shelley, would you put up those criteria? Okay, good.
There we go.
All right, here we go.
All right.
Thank you. All right, here's one of the things that you would ask if you wanted to find out, are we doing STEM? I noticed that some of you are, somebody's with NASA and you are actually designing some of the STEM lessons that are up there. I visit NASA quite frequently as far as looking at the websites. And some of you were, someone was working with parents and so forth. Take a look at these ideas to see if you're presenting actually a STEM lesson. First of all, does the lesson present a real problem, an engineering challenge? And we prefer to call them engineering challenges because it brings in that ever important concept of engineering. So when I talk to kids, I was talk about not a problem, but an engineering challenge. These can be found in a number of places if you don't have if they're just not a lot of them in your head. But first of all, it must be a real problem. Don't use things like little people from space coming down and landing and that kind of stuff. Make it actually real. Okay. Now then, the second thing, will students relate to the problem? If they don't relate, then it's not going to be a highly successful thing. Sometimes you may have to do some staging and set things up to get them engaged in the problem, you know, have a video or something, or talk with an expert or something to sort of let them see it as a real problem. Probably one of the best things you can do is let the kids identify some problems that they could solve in different ways. Number 3, does the lesson allow for multiple acceptable and creative approaches for successfully solving the problem? This is one thing that would separate this from some of the science experiments that I did when I was a science teacher, when I was in school, because I'd give them the approach to use, and everybody got the same outcome because there was only one, you know, desirable outcome for that particular experiment. A STEM lesson must allow for a number of acceptable approaches, and the more creative, really, the better. Some can be kind of out of the box, as long as they are within the realm of possibility and make some kind of sense given the research the kids have done on this. Number 4 says, does the lesson integrate and apply important science and math grade level content? Now, this is important. This is where we get off track sometimes. If I'm a teacher and I'm going to teach a STEM project, we're going to do a STEM project, I don't have time to add something extra like that to my curriculum. I'm already in a time crunch to get everything in. So I'm going to choose some math content and some science, with the help of the math teacher, by the way, and some important science content that kids are going to be learning, and we're going to include that so that the STEM lesson or project is actually an application of that content. This is one of the things that we've got to do, is add more rigor to math and to science. We're not going to quit teaching math and science, but we're going to learn how to ratchet up the learning and the rigor by integrating those to solve some real world problems and show how those interact. And I've actually had students respond to me saying, you know, now I know why I learned about flow rate in math. So it really helps. Number 5, does the lesson intentionally use the engineering design process as the approach to solve problems? The engineering design process is the key here. This whole thing is about integrating math and science through engineering. You take the engineering out and we've got nothing left. It takes the whole STEM apart. So the engineering design process is really important. Now, there are a lot of engineering design processes out there, but almost all of them have the same basic components. Here's an example that Shelley downloaded of one. The one on the far right of your screen would be the kinds of things, design process that the earlier grades might go through: to imagine, to plan, to create, then to improve the thing you created, and then to, well, first you would start with asking the question. On the left, you have the upper grades one that is used sometimes. It's just a little more well-developed, and you add a research step. You make sure that the kids research. It doesn't have to be paper and pen research. Using a science experiment can be a great way to research some information you need for the project, for the STEM project. Step 3, develop possible solutions. Then you go on down, select the best possible one, construct a prototype, test and evaluate, communicate, and then redesign. That's a much needed step that sometimes doesn't get done because we run out of time. So at any rate, that's the process that you follow, because this is teaching the kids how to think in a particular way, like an engineer, but it also teaches them a way to solve problems that will carry over through any subject and, through life. The next thing is the lesson actually using a hands-on teaching and learning approach. Stand and deliver doesn't work at all in this. And so PBL is one type of learning approach that we use. Just be really sure that you don't think that because your school is using a PBL approach that you're teaching STEM. That's not the case. You focus on STEM, which is ratcheting up the rigor of the math and science using an engineering process and bringing in the technology, but do that in a manner that is like PBL. You can use a PBL approach to do that. Ask yourself, okay, now does this lesson lead the kids to actually design and develop something? If it just stops with them imagining and thinking, well, this might work, and then they write some kind of a report about it, then you haven't done STEM. You've gotten the first 2 or 3 steps in there maybe. Is the role of technology in the lesson clear to the students? Now, the technology does not have to be digital technology, although having kids use the latest digital technology and work with that is a good thing to do. Technology can also be brought in by having them understand how the technology, maybe the technology they're creating even, might impact the society or the ecology or environment. What impact do technological systems have? What are technological systems? What impact do they have? And recognize the role that technology plays in advancing science, and then just having them be able to make informed decisions about technology. And by the way, do understand the definition that STEM uses of technology. And that is technology is anything that is created for the use of humankind by humankind. That seems a really oversimplified response to that, but it is something I'm trying to think anyway, a pencil is technology, something that has been invented or created by humans for the purpose of meeting a need or a want. So technology includes even the beakers and things that they use in solving problems sometimes. And now let's see, yes, is there some kind of experimentation in testing the solution, evaluating the results, and then does the lesson involve students in communicating their design and results? And then in redesigning, in case that isn't, in case it doesn't work, which it won't probably the first time. So those are some of the components of a STEM lesson. Now there are a lot of different directions we can go with this, but I wondered if has anybody popped up a question yet or something that either Gregg and I could answer?
Yeah. Kevin had sort of addressed the issue of, why do we need a definition, and are we possibly taking away from the component subjects when we put the focus on integration? And Gregg, you had a good response to that. I think it would be nice if you could share that on the video for the people who are going to be watching it.
I was just reflecting on what the committee that authored this report talked about during many meetings as they were coming to agreement on what the report would say. And there was a lot of discussion about definitions, whether a definition was even possible or desirable. And I think in the final analysis, the committee decided that it wasn't going to propose a single definition. They developed what they called a framework, a conceptual framework for thinking about integration in STEM. But the main point that they made that I think is relevant is that, yes, it does matter, both for teaching and learning, but also for doing research on education. what you are doing and intending to do with respect to the different disciplines in STEM. So, in other words, there's nothing inherently, terrible about throwing the STEM acronym around. But when push comes to shove, if the teacher is really doing a science lesson, it does a disservice to the other components of the STEM disciplines not to have any reference to them. For example, if you're using that acronym, simply because it perpetuates, I think, a lack of full disclosure, I guess, with respect to what's being taught and what's being learned. There's nothing wrong with having a science lesson that doesn't, although with the next generation science standards, I guess science lessons are becoming much more integrative anyway, but there's nothing inherently wrong with doing a science activity that doesn't extend into mathematics or into technology or engineering. And that's fine, and that should be called a science activity, not a STEM activity. So again, I don't want to quibble about the specific definition for STEM, but I think it is important for the reasons I outlined, that both teachers working in the classroom as well as those looking from the outside, from the research point of view, trying to understand how students learn these integrated concepts and how teachers can better teach them. I think it really does make a difference. Our committee thought it made a difference to be explicit about what is being included. And so that's.
What would you say to that, Anne? How do you see STEM being used in schools and by educators, and what do you see as the value of having a clearer, more shared, agreed upon definition of STEM?
Well, in the first place, the definition itself implies integration of the subjects. That's something that we do very poorly in school. We have silos. And so we have a silo for math, and we like to go way high and teach really deep math things. Science, the same thing. Let's go way as far as we can in science. We never act like the two even go together. We never act like there's a purpose in learning these. And that's what I have discovered with middle school. And I would imagine it carries, and elementary, but I imagine it carries through with high school, is that the kids get so excited when they find out there's a reason for learning math and science, and that they do go together. We had a particular project in which kids were building, or they were going to construct barriers to stop the flow of sediment from a runoff. And of course, they were simulating all this in the classroom. Every group and every team had their own setup because they all had different solutions. And that's when these children would come to me. They said, "Oh, now I'll learn. Now I know why I needed to know how to calculate a flow rate. Now I know why I needed to know how to do these kinds of things, because these are being used to solve a problem." We do such a disservice when we act like that we only have silos and things have no practical meaning outside those silos. And so I think that that's a really important reason for identifying STEM, for identifying the engineering component as the connector, because you have to learn to engineer something with these systems that we're learning, math and science, and for letting the kids wrap their minds around that early on, so that by the time they get to the workforce, they're used to thinking in the ways that they have to think to solve problems. That includes teamwork, for example, being competent in a lot of different areas, critical thinking, teamwork, innovation, and all that comes to play in STEM. It does not necessarily come to play when you just go straight up vertical with your subjects and they don't meet and get together. And the final thing I have to say is that it does, we're getting some test results back that indicate that it does actually ratchet up the degree of learning of math and of science. so that's what we're really after, more rigorous learning in those subjects. And we just have a better way of doing it. STEM is actually not a subject, it's a way of teaching.
Mm. What do you see as being the greatest hurdle to this integration? Is it teacher training? Is it time? Is it support from administration, from parents? I don't know. You know, tell me.
Greg, did you want to take that one?
Oh, you go right ahead.
Boy, you named them all. Now I want to start with teacher professional development. And this would be the same for any of you out there who are developing curriculum or anything like that. Be sure when you're in the school that you're on the same page about what STEM is. It's not robotics. Now, that's going to flatten some people right there. Robotics can be a STEM curriculum if the robot is designed to solve a particular problem, like maybe a robotic hand or something of that nature. But just to follow a set of instructions and build robots is not STEM. It's fun and it's great to do. It's just not STEM, okay? So be sure you know what STEM is. Then secondly, or work together with other teachers and people who are doing this and coordinate to determine what objectives you're going to meet through this STEM curriculum. You've got to meet some school objectives, math and science objectives in your school, okay? So it should be wrapped around those. And then give the teachers the engineering design process to follow so that they can do this and be sure that they're, incorporating into their lessons. And when you talk about STEM schools, this would be a school that does not, it teaches all the subjects. There are some great examples out there of how these schools incorporate that design process in every subject. And even in history, their projects are not about copying a diagram of a pyramid. It's about constructing and coming up with ideas for how that pyramid might have been built and then putting those into some kind of experimental form. There's just all kinds of good things going on when you understand what STEM is trying to accomplish in the heads of kids we're trying to prepare for the 21st century. So I would just suggest that administrators can be a problem if they don't understand what STEM is. Of course, time is always a problem, especially, that's why we're trying to integrate the STEM in with math and science. So you named them pretty well.
Gregg, can you maybe tell us a little bit of what the research so far has shown about the impact of integration, just in terms of outcome or in terms of engagement for students and teachers and school communities?
Sure. And this research is summarized in that report, as I mentioned. And of course, there's been new research since that report has come out. That's the other thing to keep in mind. But maybe not surprisingly, but disappointingly, there's relatively little evidence that we can point to from education research that documents improvements in learning above and beyond what might occur in a single subject classroom due to integrative teaching efforts. And this is in part because it's very difficult to control, to do research in education and control for variables. It also relates to just what we were talking about before, which is that researchers have not much tried to use consistent framing of their views of what STEM is or integrative STEM is, and therefore it's very hard to compare results from two or more studies of ostensibly the same phenomenon, but they're actually not the same because the research has been framed in a different way. And our report talks about that and makes recommendations, and actually suggests that parts of the report, that framework I mentioned, could be used by researchers to use a more common frame to design research questions and carry out research. So that's the high level view. The what everybody wants to know and what many people claim is that science learning improves when it's done in the context of integration. Typically, by the way, that integration is involving engineering design activities. That's just, I think, for obvious reasons. That is, it's hands-on and it's applied, and it requires communication and problem solving. There is some evidence that science learning can improve, but it's not a slam dunk. It's been much harder in the world of research to document improvements in mathematics learning. And in fact, some research that's fairly rigorous has found that learning in mathematics can, in some situations, when taught in an engineering design approach, be less than otherwise taught as an individual subject. But again, I want to caution that there are so many limitations with a lot of this research that it's hard to make definitive conclusions. A lot of what would be beneficial learning outcomes, of course, depends on the specific intervention or the instructional approach and the curriculum that are being used. And some are simply better than others. And we do talk about some of the more interesting integrative STEM curricula that are out there in our report. And I would encourage teachers who are interested in trying to do a better job of integration to look at those and to look at what the committee says about the role of the teacher. The role of the teacher is really critical in both providing or helping students remember often specific ideas in science or math or technology that they've learned in another setting and applying them in a way that is more concrete related to a design challenge or problem. This is not something that it turns out learners, adults or children, do naturally. They don't make these connections. And so educators really have to be explicit about, like Anne said, when there's a calculation to figure out a flow rate, for example, and the design of a system for filtering sediment, that a possibility or desirability of including that information really needs to be pointed out by the educator. Even for students who know the ideas and concepts, it's often not the case that they'll make the connections without help. So there are also studies that look at, as you mentioned, interests and engagement. And there we have, I think, some stronger evidence that more integrated forms of learning are more likely to interest students and to engage them. And engagement and interest are related sometimes to learning, but not always. But they're often a prerequisite to learning. And so that is, obviously, teachers are always excited if their students are excited, and doing an integrated STEM activity where there's a design component is much more likely to get students who are hands-on learners or students who don't like to sit at the desk all the time to get them engaged. There is a little bit of data that needs to be explored further, that these sort of integrative approaches to learning are more likely to engage underrepresented groups, particularly African-American students. And so there's definitely things that we can point to. It's just not as the evidence is not as strong as any of us would like, I think, at this point.
And what's your take on it? I'm actually going to I appreciate your very detailed research, and I did ask you about the research, Gregg, and the National Academies are that's what you're there for, to represent the research and to do the research. But I do think there is just an anecdotal case to be made that this integrated approach is more fun. What do you think, Ann?
Oh yeah. There's no doubt about that, for sure. And I wanted to also make the point that we, as classroom teachers, are absolutely controlled by standardized testing. You know, those math and science scores. We really want those to show different. Okay, let me tell you what we did. I was working with on some curriculum for the National Science Foundation, or under a National Science Foundation grant, I should say, not for the National Science Foundation. And when it was very carefully controlled, all the studies on it, of course, were very carefully controlled. It was a 5-year kind of thing. And here's some things that we found with those controlled studies that were outside evaluators, okay? That kids who had well-designed STEM lessons, as few as 3 to 4 per year, showed a greater depth and breadth of thinking, being able to look at a situation and show, and think about it in a logical and procedural kind of manner. They had a higher ability to critique project designs. Now, how about that for a good outcome? They had a better ability to use data than a group of comparison students who are not systematically exposed to the STEM lessons. So, we had that was just a few of the outcomes that you might call not measurable in terms of standardized testing. But we do have some good evidence on that. That, Gregg, was from a group of researchers, Van Hannigan, and et cetera, that you might be interested in that study.
Right. You're raising a really good point, Ann, and I should have said that too. But part of the problem is just what you said, that we're so focused on measuring these outcomes that are driven by assessments that we have not paid as much attention to other kinds of desired behaviors and dispositions that are probably more important, to be honest, than knowing specific facts or processes in science or math. And so I'm glad you brought that up.
Well, and that kind of speaks to from what I understand, part of the whole impetus to looking carefully at how science and math are being taught and developing a STEM approach really is very directly connected to how scientists and engineers and technologists and stuff function in the workplace, like what it actually is to do those things once one has sort of moved on. And those things are not, those skills are not necessarily going to be measured on a standardized test.
Right.
So can you speak a little bit? We're getting towards the end here, and there is a very interesting question that from the attendees that I want to ask. But before we get off of this, do you want to talk at all about the job readiness and the career workplace aspect of this, which does seem to be a big part of it, and how STEM is used?
Well, I think, sorry, go ahead, Ann.
No, you go ahead, Gregg.
Well, I was going to say, I think Ann has actually sort of covered that in a way. They've got a bunch of different names over time: 21st century skills, higher order skills, professional skills. There are different labels that have been used over the last couple decades to describe these hard to measure attributes that are valued by employers, and employers are pretty consistent, have been consistent over time and also across industry sectors about the value of having employees who are flexible in their thinking, who can be okay with uncertainty, who are able to work in teams and able to communicate, among other things. Those are some of the top order qualities that employers want. And you can kind of do a mapping of the elements of at least the engineering process, problem-solving process as laid out in the diagrams that you showed earlier, Shelley. And it's not just engineering, science has all of those qualities as well. And certainly the next generation science standards are doing a much better job of having students be involved in things that are closer to what would happen in the world of work, and therefore are more likely probably to develop some of the skills and competencies that employers are looking for. So the more relevant, the more connected, the more relevant and connected and interesting the problems are for young people, the more likely these other higher order skills, professional skills are going to get nurtured.
And you can also measure to some degree how well kids are acquiring those skills. That's one thing that we recommend as to teachers as you go along. You know, the kinds of assessments that you do, the formative assessments, you can gauge how well your kids are working in teams and how well they're self-monitoring their work and what they think about that. You can gauge how well they apply the knowledge of math that they've learned in math and science. You can gauge how well they're using the engineering design process as they go along, which is a thinking process that they're learning. And one thing it really impacts is their skills, their attitudes, and their confidence. When they realize that they can solve problems, it makes their attitudes dramatically change about different subjects. They go from not even wanting to go in the subject's classroom to not waiting, can hardly wait to get there. And don't forget about the diversity we have in this nation in terms of people and abilities and the different types of abilities and things of that nature. STEM is a great place for kids to come together with, even kids who have challenges and so forth, and work successfully to accomplish things, and so that they feel good about what they've done and they've actually had a contributing role. And it's certainly a great place for minorities, for girls, for people like that have been traditionally underrepresented in those vocations to gain speed and to come aboard with that.
That was great. We did have a question that I want to get to, which is how do you guys feel about adding letters to STEM? The most popular one is obviously STEAM, with the addition of art. Although I was at a conference where their A stood for architecture, which I thought was very interesting. So I think as the letters get added, they seem to be added by people who have a strong reason to want to add them. So what do you think about additional letters?
Well, I mean, I think it's just what you said, that people in a particular area that feel ignored or neglected, but know that their subject matter is very relevant and interesting, want to find ways to make that point. And I certainly understand that. And I personally have no objection to STEAM. There's also STEM with 2 M's, with one of the M's being medicine.
Mm-hmm.
As long as as I think I said before, as long as one is being clear about the use of the term and what you intend by it, that's the most important thing to me. To not use these acronyms as casually as typically been used. If you really want to advance education in these areas that are more connected in a connected way, you really do have to be clear about what you mean and tell others what you mean, and then try to practice what you preach. So there's plenty of art in engineering, as most of you probably know, and there's lots of history in science, and there's history in engineering. Somebody asked earlier in the chat window about, you know, including ethics and social studies, and absolutely there are design challenges, for example, in engineering that surface the need to think about culture and society and ethical issues, as in fact almost every engineering challenge and solution should. So I think it's a rich area. That's my personal view, that it's artificial to put barriers around 4 letters. I mean, they're accidental to begin with, in a sense. They came about through some sort of arbitrary writings of a couple of NSF program officers back in the 90s, is my understanding. And but there is a logic to it. You know, I'm not saying they shouldn't be together. There is a logic to thinking about these subjects together, but I think it is also logical to think about art and other of the social sciences.
What's your take on it, Ann?
Well, have you ever taught something to students without drawing a sketch as you were doing that? You know, that's art. You're drawing sketches. We're asking kids to sketch their thinking and so forth, and present it to. Art is automatically included. We ask people, you know, after a product is invented, then we need some way to make it beautiful, make it. Engineers are not lacking in skills as far as, you know, design skills, and as far as art is concerned. But I do think that the art, you know, has some kind of ability to help generate creativity. But it can't be just artificially thrown in there. So, oh, we've got to do art with this. Well, why? What purpose will the art serve in this project? Then it can be incorporated. Maybe it won't serve any in one particular project that you can see, although I don't know how. You can't get through any kind of lessons without some kind of pictures, art, or whatever, you know. But if you're asking if we should have art taught specifically, in every STEM project, we've got to include art, we've got to include social studies. No. STEM, actually, it's making strong connections between math and science, and in a well thought out, intentional approach. And to the extent that other subjects are brought into that, then that's very important. We certainly need a lot of language arts skills, and maybe even some speech skills and so forth during the communications phase. So everything works together. Let's just don't decide that, well, since everything works together, we're just going to spread everything out equally and put equal focus on everything in a STEM project. No, we've got to keep STEM, the STEM focus and the STEM purpose as the main driver, and then naturally incorporate the other subjects, I think.
Well, I think that's probably a really great place to end it, with STEM representing the great integration of all ways of seeing and being and communicating and working together to solve problems. I want to thank so much our guests today, Ann Jolly and Gregg Pearson. It's been my pleasure to host this event, and hope to see you all again at another video conversation, maybe next week even. Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.